Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome back to my channel, and this is episode or lesson 3 of the Seerah and Biography of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So of course we're going to start off with the lesson 2 review. What kind of people hired nannies and caretakers? The answer is the rich did. Halima was the name of the Prophet ﷺ's caretaker. Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, took care of the Prophet ﷺ after the death of his grandfather. The first job was a shepherd. 2 things that destroyed the Kaaba was a flood and a fire. One way the modern Kaaba is different than the original is that it is in the shape of a cube now. It used to be a rectangle. Surah Kawthar was revealed upon the death of his son Abdullah. And the tribes were fighting over the placement of the black stone when rebuilding the Kaaba. Alright. So starting off with today's lesson, we said that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ received revelation at the age of 40. Now before getting the message, the Prophet ﷺ would see little signs here and there. So he would seclude himself often in the cave of Hira. As you can see, it's a very small cave and you're able to go and visit when you go to Mecca. A lot of people climb on top and see exactly where the location happened, which is pretty cool. That's definitely on my bucket list, inshallah. And the mountain is called the Jabal of Nur, which means light, and it has a very clear view of the Kaaba, so that's why he really liked it. And it was founded by his grandfather Abdul Muttalib. He would stay for a few days at a time with food and water that his wife Khadija Radha Anha would bring for him. And the little signs that he would witness is that he would start hearing rocks and stones saying salam to him, and he saw a dream every night for 6 months that would basically show him a prophecy or revelation that would come true the next day. So he'll see something and then the next day it would come true. So this was consistent for 6 months before getting the revelation. And revelation officially began in the month of Ramadan. On a Saturday or a Sunday, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ saw a light and heard a sound. And then Monday, Jibreel alayhi salam came. So that was during one of the last 10 days of Ramadan. So wahi is a word to describe the delivering of the message of prophethood from the angel Jibreel, and Iqra is the Arabic word for read. So Jibreel alayhi salam comes in his true form to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and squeezed him very tightly and said, Iqra, read. And then he let go. And he did this 3 times. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was illiterate. And, he said, I could not read. But the angel kept saying, read, 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 Iqra, Iqra. And, let go. And after all this happened, the Prophet ﷺ, of course, was very terrified. And he runs back to Khadija Radha Anha. And he says, Zamiduni, which means, to cover him. And she consoled him. Then they went to Waraqa, which is the cousin of Khadija Radha Anha. And if you remember, he is one of the 5 or 6 people left that still were on the monotheistic religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So upon hearing this, he knew right away that this is the message of prophethood. You're a prophet. And of course, he became Muslim. 6 months or 40 days after this went by and no wahi came, the Prophet ﷺ was waiting anxiously for Jibreel, did this really happen? And he started having doubts, And then one day, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ heard a sound and saw Jibreel sitting on the throne in the heavens and the earth when he looked up at the sky. And he goes back to Khadija Radha Anha, and Surah Muddathir at this point is revealed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where Allah commands him to start spreading the message of Islam. So here are a list of some of the very early converts. Of course, we have Khadija Radha Anha and Waraqa, the cousin of Khadija Radha Anha. And then, first they started spreading Islam to the Prophet's household and his family. So we have Ali Radha Anhu, who was the first child. He was very young at the time, and he's the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The first slave or servant is Zayd Radha Anhu, and remember, he was the adopted son of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So again, he's in the same household. The first free man to accept Islam was Abu Bakr Radha Anhu. He was the best friend and companion, the closest companion of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. They're always together, and their names will always be together. So he's a very important figure, of course, as we'll come to know. The first person to die for Islam is Sumayya Radha Anha. So unfortunately, I will say very soon, a lot of torture was going on around this time. So unfortunately, a lot of the people actually lost their lives. And now this is the next batch of converts. So Uthman Rita Anhu, he ends up marrying 2 of the daughters of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, of course, one at different times. So we'll talk about him later. Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas Anhu, he was around 16. He was very young, and his mother was emotionally blackmailing him and torturing him to try to convince him to leave Islam and stuff. So of course he was rewarded for that, but he had a tough time as well with his family. Zubayr Anhu was the cousin of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu. Abdullah ibn Masud, he was a servant and a shepherd, and he wanted some milk. So the Prophet ﷺ went to like a very old goat, and it was a miracle. It started giving milk, and he was of course with Abu Bakr too. So after seeing this, he becomes Muslim. And then Abdurrahman ibn Auf was a businessman, and he became one of the richest in Medina later on. And now the slave class. So with Islam, a big thing is that, everyone is equal. Racism is non-existent. It doesn't matter your financial or social status and everything. The only thing that sets you apart from people is your character and, your obedience to Allah. So Islam really appealed to the slave class. And some of the most important or the most famous that we know of is Bilal Rita Anhu, Khabbab Rita Anhu, Sumayya and Yasir, their husband and wife. Dawah means spreading the message of Islam, and there are 5 stages. Number 1, private stage. So this lasted for 3 years, and basically, again, it was in secret, mostly just to family members, and then it eventually becomes public only by tongue, word of mouth, no military or fighting. Number 3, open dawah with fighting against one enemy group, and we'll talk about the main enemies in a little bit. Number 4, open dawah with defense if necessary, but they did not have an official army. And then lastly, open dawah with physical confrontation to anyone, so they did have an army at that point. I made a little chart talking about the different leaders of Mecca at the time. So on top we have the Quraysh. So in red are the Kafirs, which means the disbelievers and the enemies of Islam. The 4 names under Banu Hashim, they are the uncles of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu. Of course, Abu Talib in red, he's the one that raised him, and unfortunately he dies a kafir, so he does not accept Islam. And in the green, eventually these people become Muslim later on. So the main people that I want to talk about is Abu Lahab, Abu Jahl, and Walid. These are the main enemies of Islam. Down below, Uqba and Umayyah. Umayyah is the master of Bilal, so again, Bilal was the slave, anhu. So these are the main enemies of Islam. And basically, they did a lot of things to kind of humiliate the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu. They were threatening them, they were trying to bribe them, they tried everything they could. One time the Prophet Sallallahu was praying, and they took camel guts, threw it on top of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and it was so heavy that it weighed him down and he actually fell. And Fatima anha, his daughter, the Prophet ﷺ's daughter, was crying and tried to, clean him and everything. So they did really horrible things to publicly humiliate the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And Uqba was the one who threw the camel guts on the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Abu Talib, although he was not Muslim, he did do his best to protect his nephew. Some of the companions tried, whenever they would try to publicly recite the Quran, people started beating them. And I want to talk about some of the torture of the slaves. So Bilal Rita Anhu, his master Umayyah, would have him lie down in the desert heat and stack these big boulders on his chest, and it would literally crush his bones and stuff. So, and of course they were burning hot, so that was really horrible. And he also would brand them with iron, get it red hot, and actually put it on the skin of these slaves. People actually passed out because of the pain. And a lot of the Sahaba later on, they would whenever they would see the scars on their bodies, because of the torture, they would just literally burst out crying every time because of what they had to endure. Bilal Raitan, was also given to gangs with rope around his neck and dragged throughout the streets, and he kept saying one word, ahad, ahad, which means one. And people asked him, why would you always repeat this one word? And he said that if I knew anything else about Islam, I would have said that. Subhanallah. With Khabbab Raitan, he was a slave, but he was also a very good sword maker. His female owner would told the gangs to beat him and again burned the iron on his back. The Prophet ﷺ made dua and she died because of a disease. Yasir and Sumaya, the husband and wife, they were tortured with their two sons, Abdullah and Ammar anhu. They were the first martyrs of Islam. Yasir anhu was dragged in the streets and pulled apart by horses, and Sumaya spit on Abu Jahl, one of the enemies, and he killed her with a spear. They killed Abdullah, the older son, but Ammar anhu, gave in and said that, okay, I'm not Muslim, basically, and they let him go. He was 15 years old at the time, and of course he was very upset, and he told the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, I said this, but it was because of the torture, I didn't actually mean it, and of course he was excused. At this point, Surah Nahl was revealed, which basically said that Allah says that it is okay to say that you disbelieve if you're tortured and your heart is still pure. There were also assassination attempts. The Prophet ﷺ suggested people to migrate to Abyssinia, and Abyssinia, as you could see here, is present-day Ethiopia. So some of the early Muslims, because of the torture and everything, went here. Abyssinia had a Christian king, but he was very just and allowed them to worship freely whoever they wanted to. And this happened around the 5th year of the Dawah. 17 people, 12 men and 5 women ended up going. Among them was Uthman anhu and the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Ruqayyah. They were married. The Sahaba returned after 3 months because they heard a rumor that the Quraysh had accepted Islam. Of course, this was not true. So when the Muslims returned back to Mecca and found out that the rumor was false, they decided, okay, we're going back to Abyssinia again. And this time, the second time, more than 80 Muslims migrated. And they were headed by Ja'far ibn Abi Talib anhu, which is another cousin of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And these Muslims were in Abyssinia for 12 years. Eventually, he did accept Islam privately. The Prophet ﷺ told the Muslims to remain as a plan B, and this was before, of course, Medina was secured as the official place for the Muslims to migrate later on. Now we're going to talk about the conversion of Hamza anhu, which is one of the uncles of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. His name was in green on that chart that I showed earlier. He was a talented hunter and an archer. Abu Jahl was insulting the Prophet ﷺ a lot and the ancestors, and of course this sense of honor and pride of your family kind of kicked in, and basically Hamza anhu was upset about that and smacked Abu Jahl with his bow and basically in the moment declared Islam out of anger. We're also going to talk about another big conversion, which is Umar anhu. Umar anhu, it's very interesting because he was very well known in the community, mostly for his temper. He was a very strong man, a very dominating figure, and a lot of people would say that, his donkey would convert to Islam before Umar ever did. So, he was a huge figure, and 3 days after the conversion of Hamza, the uncle anhu, Umar anhu accepted Islam. The Prophet ﷺ made dua for either Umar or Abu Jahl to accept Islam because they both were one of the 2 main biggest names in the area. Whoever was more beloved to Allah, he made dua, please allow them to be given guidance. And so one day Umar anhu went out at night to drink, and he goes to the Kaaba and he hears the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ praying, and he has the intention to hurt him. He starts listening to the Quran, and the Prophet ﷺ was reciting Surah Haqqa, and he thought in his mind that this must be poetry. And then the ayah said, this is not poetry, or something like that. Then he said, this must be sorcery, some kind of magic. The next ayah the Prophet ﷺ recited was nor is this magic. So he was really confused, how is the Prophet ﷺ, reading his mind in a way kind of thing. So he went back home. Abu Jahl insulted the Prophet ﷺ again and promised wealth to anyone who kills the Prophet ﷺ, and Umar anhu was going to go do it. Then he starts to hear things and finds out that his sister and brother-in-law, so her husband, accepts Islam. So he goes back to their house. He hears them reciting the Quran and he punches his sister. But once he calms down and he asks to read the Quran, after that, he actually accepts Islam and he realizes that this is the truth. And it's a very interesting story, but that's how that went. He goes to Abu Jahl and tells him that he's a Muslim now and announced it to basically the whole city. Now we're going to talk about the year of sorrow and the boycott. The Quraysh were threatening Abu Talib and said that they'll cut him off. This is now the 7th year of the dawah. And the people were basically saying no one marries these Muslims, no one give them any business or money or food, and basically put a whole boycott on them. They moved to the valleys outside of Mecca and basically were in exile. And eventually the Quraysh did make a treaty against the Banu Hashim, economic treaty, political and social. The boycott lasted for 2 to 3 years, and it was so bad that they had to drink rainwater, eat leaves, and had to get supplies secretly. Some sympathetic Quraysh did try to stand up to Abu Jahl, and Allah caused a miracle to happen where the treaty was eaten by termites and ants, so it was no longer. And the only part of the treaty that was left was Allah's name, of course. Abu Lahab, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, one of the enemies, disassociated himself from his tribe and family and remained in the city. So here are the incidents, 3 events during the year of sorrow, which is why it's given that name. And all these calamities happened within 2 months. So it was in a very short period of time, and it was very, very hard on the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. 5 to 6 weeks after they returned from the boycott, Abu Talib, the uncle, fell sick and passed away. He tried to get his uncle to recite the Shahada and accept Islam, and saying that just say this, whisper this one sentence to me and I'll argue for you on your behalf. Abu Talib was about to say it, but Abu Jahl put doubts in his minds and started mocking him last minute while he was on his deathbed, and he ended up dying upon the idolatry and not Islam. The next thing that happened was the death of his wife Khadija radhiyallahu anha. Because of the boycott, it really impacted her health greatly, so she unfortunately did not survive. And this happened within 40 days of the death of Abu Talib. The Prophet ﷺ did not smile for months. And then lastly, the incident of Ta'if. Ta'if is a city. It became impossible for the Muslims to stay in Mecca, and they thought about Ta'if because it was the largest, closest city at the time, and the Prophet ﷺ and Zayd ibn Haritha, his adopted quote-unquote son, walked to Ta'if secretly. They met with 3 leaders and asked them to accept Islam, but they rejected and mocked the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and they stayed in Ta'if for a week to preach. Someone converted, and it sparked a mob, and the leaders began to panic. So the people ended up stoning the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and they did it so much that his sandals were actually soaked with blood, and it was a very sad day. Zayd radhiyallahu anhu tried to protect him, but it wasn't very successful. And after that, the Prophet ﷺ sat under a tree, and Jibreel Islam came down with the angel of the mountains. Every angel has like a specific job and duty assigned to them, and he offered to destroy the city if the Prophet ﷺ commanded to do so because of how much they hurt him. But the Prophet ﷺ said no, hoping that their offspring might end up worshipping Allah. And eventually that's, subhanAllah, what happened. Abu Talib, Al-Walid, and Abu Lahab have passed away at this point, so Abu Jahl is the main leader at the time. Now we're gonna end with the review questions. Number 1, what is the name of the cave where the revelation started? Number 2, name one sign of prophethood before the revelation. What day of the week and month did revelation begin? Name one of the early Sahabas. Which social class of people accepted Islam easily? Who was the first to die for Islam? And which country did the early Muslims migrate to? Jazakallah khairan for watching. I hope you guys found this lesson helpful, and I hope you're enjoying the series. Inshallah, next time we're going to start talking about the Isra al-Miraj, which is the journey to the heavens of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and also we're going to start talking about the city of Medina, so migration and everything like that. Jazakallah khairan once again. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.